The night settles softly around you. A quiet blanket spread across the sky. The stars glimmer in their ancient watch. Each one steady. Each one whispering of promises older than time itself. In this stillness, hearts are invited to rest. To let go of the noise and weight of the day. And to enter into a story woven with trust. With faith. With the tender unfolding of God's plan. This story does not begin with ease. Nor does it unfold with simplicity. It begins with a man named Abraham. A man who had once heard the voice of God calling him from all that was familiar. Away from the land of his fathers. Away from the certainty of his past. Toward a promise unseen. He had left everything behind because God had spoken. And his heart had chosen trust. In the years that followed, Abraham walked a winding road. He waited long years for the fulfillment of that promise. A child who would carry forward the covenant. The laughter of a son born not of human strength but of God's faithfulness. Isaac. The boy whose very name meant laughter. The boy whose birth had turned sorrow into joy. Whose cries had filled a tent once silent. And yet, as we draw close to this moment in Abraham's life, we see that faith is not a single step, but a path that stretches onward. A path that tests. A path that deepens. For trust is not merely believing once. It is believing again and again. Even when the request feels impossible. Even when the way feels heavy. Close your eyes and picture the quietness of a desert night. The sands are cool beneath your feet. The air carries the faint chill of evening. The stars burn bright against the darkness. Around the tents of Abraham's camp, the fires glow softly. Servants move quietly. Animals rest in stillness. And somewhere within the encampment, Isaac sleeps. The child of promise. His breathing steady. His face peaceful. Unaware of the weight of the days to come. Abraham sits awake. His heart lifted to the one who had called him long ago. His journey had been marked by both triumph and failure. By trust and by weakness. But always, by the faithfulness of God. The land he now dwells in is the land of promise. His son is the fulfillment of long years of waiting. And yet, in the quiet of this night, God's voice has spoken again, calling him to a test beyond imagination. Before the journey begins, before the mountain rises in the distance, before the altar is built, we pause here, in the stillness of a beginning. A man, a father, a servant of God, sitting beneath the stars, holding in his heart both the laughter of his son and the weight of a command that he does not yet understand. This is where our meditation begins tonight. With the mystery of God's ways. with the tension between promise and obedience, with the question of how trust can endure when it is stretched to its furthest edge. Let your breathing slow now. In and out, steady as the desert wind. Let your shoulders soften. Let your thoughts rest. As Abraham once lifted his gaze to the heavens, lift yours too, and know that the same God who guided him, who held his future secure, who tested him but never abandoned him, is the same God who watches over you now. This story is not merely about sacrifice. It is about the heart of trust. A trust that leans into mystery. A trust that surrenders even what is most loved. A trust that finds rest not in understanding but in the assurance of God's goodness. And as you listen, as you rest upon this quiet road of faith, may you feel the peace that comes from knowing that God's plan, though sometimes hidden, is always faithful, always loving, always enough. Long before the weight of this night, long before the command that now pressed upon Abraham's heart, there had been another moment, another call, a beginning woven with promise. Abraham had once been Abram, a man dwelling in the land of yore, surrounded by the customs of his ancestors, the idols of his people, the security of familiarity. And then the voice of God came, clear, unmistakable, calling him out of everything he had known. Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. The promise was vast, breathtaking, far beyond what Abram could measure. He was already advanced in years. His wife, Sarai, barren. Their future seemingly fixed in the patterns of age and disappointment. Yet the voice of God spoke life into barrenness, spoke hope into impossibility. And Abram believed. So he left. He gathered his household, his herds, his servants, and he set out upon a road that led only forward, away from the familiar, into the unknown, guided by nothing but trust. Each step was a surrender, each mile a testimony that obedience begins with listening. Seasons came and went. Years stretched on. And still the promise remained unseen. Abram's faith was tested again and again. Famine drove him to Egypt. Conflict arose with his nephew Lot. Battles were fought. Journeys endured. And still there was no child, no heir, no seed through whom the promise would continue. But the voice of God returned, speaking once more beneath the canopy of night. Look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be. Abram lifted his eyes, gazing into the endless night sky. Stars scattered like countless promises, each one a spark of hope against the darkness. And Scripture tells us, Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Faith became the mark of his life. Not perfection, not flawless obedience, but faith. A trust that clung to the promise even when circumstances spoke otherwise. And then, at last, after decades of waiting, after laughter and tears, after doubts and reassurances, the promise took flesh. Isaac was born, the son whose very name meant laughter. The barren womb of Sarah gave birth to joy. The tent that had once echoed with silence now rang with the sound of a child. Abraham held the boy in his arms, his heart swelling with gratitude. Sarah's laughter mingled with tears as she nursed the child she had long thought impossible. The camp rejoiced. Servants smiled. Neighbors marveled. For this was no ordinary birth. This was the fulfillment of a covenant, the living proof that God keeps His word. And Abraham's heart must have thought, surely this is the end of the testing. Surely the long years of waiting have come to their conclusion. Surely now the rest of life will be marked only by blessing and peace. But faith does not end with receiving the promise. It continues into the keeping of trust. Faith is not only believing when the womb is barren. It is believing when the promise itself is placed upon the altar. And so, as Abraham remembered the long road that had led him here, the voice that had called him out of Ur, the stars that had promised countless descendants, the miracle of Isaac's birth, he knew that the God who had never failed him before would not fail him now. Even when the command felt heavy, even when the request seemed to tear at the very fabric of his heart, Abraham's soul carried this memory. The God who calls is the God who provides. The God who promises is the God who fulfills. The God who leads into mystery is the God who never abandons His own. And so beneath the desert sky, as Isaac slept within the tent, Abraham remembered, and remembering gave him strength. Take a slow breath now. Let it fill your lungs like the night sky filled with stars. And release it gently. Just as Abraham once lifted his gaze upward and believed, so too may your heart rest tonight in the assurance that God's promises are sure. His plan, though hidden, is always faithful. Isaac, the promised child, the laughter of Sarah's old age, the joy that had turned sorrow into singing. He was not just any son. He was the miracle that had made the impossible possible. The living proof that God's word does not return empty. From the first cry that pierced the silence of the tent, Isaac's life was marked by wonder. His father's eyes filled with tears each time he looked upon him. His mother's arms clung tightly, unwilling to let go of what she had thought she would never hold. Neighbors marveled. Servants rejoiced. Travelers told the story of the aged couple who had borne a son in their twilight years. And Isaac grew. His feet learned the rhythm of running through the camp. His laughter echoed against the hills. His questions filled the air with curiosity. He was the joy of his parents' hearts, the child through whom every promise of God would flow. Abraham watched him often in quiet wonder, remembering the years when his tent had been silent, the nights when he had gazed at the stars, wondering how God's word would come true. And now, here was Isaac, living, breathing, running, laughing. Each day with the boy was a reminder that God is faithful. Sarah too rejoiced. She who had once laughed in disbelief now laughed in delight. She would watch her son play in the fields, and her laughter was mingled with awe. For she knew that every smile, every step, every sound of Isaac's voice was a miracle written across her life. The camp itself seemed brighter with the boy's presence. His youth brought energy to the tents. His laughter softened the weariness of the servants. His joy reminded everyone who saw him that God's promises endure. Yet Isaac was more than his parents' delight. He was the covenant embodied, the heir through whom God's promise of countless descendants would one day be fulfilled. Every generation that would come after was tied to this child. Every hope of Abraham's line was wrapped in his life. And this made him all the more precious, all the more beloved. Abraham's heart swelled with gratitude when he saw Isaac asleep beneath the stars, his small chest rising and falling with steady breath, his face at peace. How could such a child be anything other than a gift? How could such laughter ever be surrendered? These were thoughts Abraham could not yet bear to dwell on. But beneath them all was the truth that Isaac belonged first to God, that the laughter was given, not earned, that the promise itself was held within the hands of the giver. For now, Isaac lived freely in the delight of his parents. The boy's trust was simple. He ran to his father with open arms. He rested against his mother without fear. He knew nothing of testing, nothing of altars, nothing of commands that stretched the soul beyond its limits. To Abraham, this innocence was both joy and weight. Joy because Isaac's laughter brought life to every moment. Weight because Abraham knew that every gift of God also carried a call. And sometimes the call asked for surrender. But for now, in these early days of Isaac's youth, the camp was filled with gladness. The sun rose upon mornings of play. The evenings echoed with stories told by the fire. And in the heart of Abraham, gratitude and love mingled together. Isaac was more than a son. He was the beloved. He was the promise made flesh. He was the living reminder that when God speaks, His word will not fail. As you picture the boy in your mind, see him laughing in the fields, his steps quick and sure, his voice ringing with joy. Let his image remind you of the promises God has placed in your own life, the gifts He has given, the laughter He has restored. Take a slow breath. Let it rest upon you like the warmth of a child's smile. And breathe out with gratitude. For every good and perfect gift comes from above. And every promise He has spoken is yes and amen. And just as Abraham cherished Isaac, so too does God cherish you. Beloved, held, a child of promise. The days with Isaac were filled with laughter. But then, without warning, a word came from God that pierced the stillness of Abraham's life. A word unlike any other. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. The words fell heavy, unthinkable. How could the God who had promised life, who had given Isaac as the fulfillment of years of waiting, now speak of surrendering him upon an altar? Abraham's heart trembled. The voice was clear, unmistakable. The same voice that had once called him out of Ur. The same voice that had promised him descendants as countless as the stars. The same voice that had given Sarah laughter when her womb had been barren. And yet, this command seemed to stand against everything that had come before. Abraham did not shout, did not argue, did not collapse beneath the weight of the words. He sat in the silence of night, the stars above him unchanged, the promise still written across the heavens. And within him the struggle began. What father could endure such a command? What heart could bear to lay upon the altar the child of its deepest love? Isaac was more than a son. He was the covenant itself. The laughter of Sarah. The fulfillment of promises spoken by God. To lose him would not only break a father's heart, it would seem to unravel God's plan. And yet, Abraham knew the voice. He knew the one who spoke. He had walked with him through years of waiting. He had seen his faithfulness again and again. He had witnessed barren places blossom with life. He had heard his promises and watched them unfold in ways no human hand could design. The command was incomprehensible. But the God who gave it was trustworthy. So Abraham sat in the weight of mystery, torn between love for his son and obedience to his God. He remembered the laughter of Isaac, the warmth of his small hand in his own, the sound of his footsteps in the camp. And he remembered too the voice of the Almighty, the one who had never failed him, the one whose word had always proven true. It was not a choice between love for Isaac and love for God. It was a call to trust that God's love for Isaac was even greater than his own. A call to believe that the same God who gave life could never misuse it. A call to surrender what was most precious, believing that the giver's plan was higher than what the human heart could comprehend. The night was long, and heavy, and silent. But in that silence Abraham's faith deepened. Not through understanding, but through trust. For true faith is not found only in receiving the promise, but in surrendering it back into the hands of the giver. Take a breath here. Feel the weight of this moment. The silence between command and obedience. The ache of love pressed against the mystery of God's will. Let your heart rest in the assurance that though His ways may feel hidden, His heart is always faithful. Abraham could not see the end of the story. He could not see the ram caught in the thicket. He could not see the covenant renewed after the test. He only saw the command, the mountain ahead, and the God who had spoken. And in the depths of his soul, he chose trust. The night stretched long around the camp. A wide circle of darkness laid gently over tents and tethered animals. Fires settled into embers. Servants drifted to sleep, and the stars stood in their silent watch. Abraham remained awake, still as a stone beside the doorway of his tent. Eyes lifted and lowered and lifted again, moving between the heavens and the shadowed earth like a man walking a narrow bridge of trust. Within that quiet, memories rose and fell like the tide. The first call to leave his father's house. The open road through lands unknown. The covenant spoken beneath a roof of stars. The laughter that burst from Sarah when the promise found her at last. Isaac's first cry. Isaac's first steps. Isaac's hand tucked into his own. Each memory was a light, and each light pressed gently against the new command that seemed to unmake everything it illuminated. He listened to the camp breathing, to the slow hush of sleeping cattle, to the flutter of tent flaps when a cooler wind lifted across the dunes. Every ordinary sound declared that the world still held together. Yet inside his chest a seam pulled and trembled. He reached for the one place that had never failed him. The presence of the God who had given the promise. No words spilled into the night. Only a yielding, a quiet bowing of the heart. Abraham had no clever answer to offer. No argument strong enough to bend the heavens. Only the remembrance of a voice that had never deceived him. And the knowledge that the giver of Isaac would not become a destroyer of his own word. If the Holy One commanded a road through shadow, then somewhere upon that road a mercy waited unseen. He rose and moved softly through the tent, eyes lingering upon Sarah's resting form, upon the curve of Isaac's shoulder where the blanket gathered in gentle folds. The boy's breath came easy, the breath of one who trusted the world without needing to ask it questions. Abraham's hands hovered at his sides, longing to draw the child close, yet unwilling to wake what God had given him to carry toward a mountain at dawn. He stepped outside again, letting the night cool his face. The stars were sharper now, the air clearer. He remembered that once the Lord had asked him to count those lights, a number beyond numbers, a sign of descendants that would fill the earth. The promise had not changed. The sky still sang it. If the author of that promise now required Isaac upon an altar, then the promise would still stand on the far side of obedience, even if Abraham could not imagine its path. Trust is not the absence of ache. It is the placing of ache into hands that will not drop it. Abraham felt the ache. He let it widen, and then he placed it where every other fear had gone before, into the keeping of the one who had called him friend. He leaned into that friendship with all the weight of his bewilderment, and found that it held. He gathered his thoughts as a shepherd gathers lambs at nightfall, drawing them from the edges of panic toward the center of peace. The command was clear, the journey plain, the steps few and simple. Rise at first light. Split wood for the offering. Saddle the donkey. Call for 2 young men to accompany them a while. Take Isaac with him. Set his face toward Moriah. Walk until the mountain rose like a question in stone. In the hush before dawn he prepared the wood. Each stroke of the blade released the resinous breath of the tree, a fragrance sweet and sorrowing. He stacked the pieces carefully, not as a man resigned to blind fate, but as a servant who believed even this trembling obedience would find an altar of mercy at its end. The wood answered the knife with small cries, and each cry the night swallowed. He checked the donkey's tack, smoothed the leather straps with a steady palm, set aside provisions for the road, water for the way, a small bundle of bread. Ordinary preparations for an extraordinary command. He returned to the doorway and watched the horizon pale. Gray lifted from black. Then the faintest band of rose appeared where sky meets earth. Within the tent Isaac stirred, turning toward the warmth of morning's first thought. It would be time soon. The long night had not solved anything. It had simply made space for trust to root deeper than fear. Abraham breathed out slowly and entered the tent. He touched Isaac's shoulder with a father's gentleness. The boy woke easily, as boys do when a journey promises new sights and higher paths. There was no hint of dread in him, only the natural joy of walking beside his father. Abraham wrapped that joy around his own heart as a borrowed cloak against the cold of what he could not understand. Sarah rose and tended to morning tasks, the quiet rituals that hold a household steady. Abraham's eyes met hers for a brief and tender moment. promises and questions crossing the space between them without sound. She had laughed for joy when Isaac came. She would laugh again one day. Abraham held to that unseen future as to a rope lowered from heaven. They stepped into the dawn. He placed the wood upon the donkey. He took in his hand the fire and the knife. Simple tools for worship. Severe in their purpose. Holy in their final meaning. The two young servants joined them, cheerful with the strength of youth. Isaac fell into stride at his father's side. The gait of trust. The ease of belonging. The camp receded behind them, tents shrinking to pale dots. Then to memory. The road rose in gentle swells. Their shadows lengthened and shortened as the sun climbed. Abraham kept his pace even, refusing haste, refusing the panic that runs before grace has time to reveal itself. He measured the journey by prayers held in the marrow rather than words shaped by the lips. The first day's march gave them heat and wind. The second gave them quiet and the company of their own thoughts. The third would give them the mountain. Through each day the long night continued within him. Not with sleeplessness now, but with a wakefulness to God that did not dim. He watched for signs of kindness along the way. A small pool where animals could drink. A cluster of acacia throwing its slender shade. The simple blessing of Isaac's voice when he named a bird overhead or pointed out a distant ridge that looked like a great lion asleep. These mercies stitched the hours together. When the sun leaned westward on the first day, they paused and made a small fire. Bread warmed on the stones. Water passed from hand to hand. Isaac rested his head against his father's arm and spoke of nothing heavy. Abraham listened as if every ordinary word were treasure, letting its brightness enter the places that threatened to go dark. The night that followed was softer than the one before. Not because the command had lightened, but because trust had learned to breathe inside it. At dawn they walked again. Dust rose and settled about their ankles. The land opened into long, low hills like folded garments. In that widening Abraham's heart found a wider place too. He remembered other thresholds where trust had been asked of him. The moment he yielded Lot the green Jordan plain. The hour he interceded for Sodom with boldness and tears. The seasons he waited beyond hoping for a child. Each time the Holy One had met him with mercy. Not always the shape he sought, but always the goodness he needed. If God had been faithful then, he would be faithful now. As the second evening gathered, they lay under a roof of stars. Isaac quieted at Abraham's side. The boy's presence was a steady flame against the night. Abraham kept that flame in view, not to guard it from God, but to keep his own heart from staggering. He slept in broken intervals, and in each waking he returned to the same posture. Open hands within his spirit. Not clinging. Not resisting. simply yielding what he loved most to the love that had given him everything. Morning of the third day broke clean, light washing the ridges with gold. Far ahead a high rise of land drew the sky to itself. Abraham looked and knew. The mountain waited. The long night within him stood up and faced the day. He felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve, a readiness to discover what the Lord would do where vision ended and obedience began. He turned to the young servants and measured the path with his eyes. Soon they would leave the pair of them and the donkey below while father and son went on alone. He gathered the wood and weighed it in his hands before placing it across Isaac's back. The boy accepted the burden with the simplicity of one who trusts the wisdom of his father. Abraham took the fire and the knife once more. The instruments of offering. The implements through which worship would become a door to the unseen mercy he could not yet name. They began the climb. Steps steady. Breathing slow. The long night did not end as the sun rose higher. It walked with them. But now it felt different. It had become a sanctuary rather than a storm. A place where love and obedience stood together, not as enemies pulling him apart, but as friends bearing him up toward the place where God would reveal himself anew. And so the night of wrestling gave birth to a day of walking. And the walking carried them toward a summit where heaven had already prepared what earth could not imagine. Abraham's face was set. Isaac's steps were sure. And the God who tests in love went before them. Unseen. Faithful. Ready with provision that waits on the far side of trust. The dawn of the appointed morning came quietly. The desert sky brushed with pale light. The air cool and still before the sun's ascent. Abraham rose from his rest, though sleep had scarcely touched him. His body was weary, but his spirit carried a strange, steady calm. Not the absence of ache, but the presence of trust. He moved quietly through the camp, gathering what was needed. His hands touched the wood he had split the night before. Each piece a weight of both burden and offering. He set them in order, stacking them carefully, as though reverence belonged even to this simple labor. For Abraham knew that worship begins not at the altar, but in every step of obedience along the way. The donkey stirred as he approached. Abraham fastened the load upon its back. Securing the bundles of wood, the vessel for fire, the knife wrapped in cloth. He moved with deliberate slowness. Each motion a prayer. Not of words, but of surrender. He called for 2 young men of his household, servants whose strength would carry them part of the journey. They rose quickly, unaware of the weight of the errand. Their eyes were bright with the energy of youth. They asked no questions, trusting their master's quiet authority. And then Abraham turned to the tent. Isaac lay there, still wrapped in the comfort of early morning rest. The boy stirred as his father's shadow fell across him, blinking away the haze of sleep. When Abraham touched his shoulder, Isaac smiled. ready to walk wherever his father led. There was no hesitation in him, no knowledge of the command that pressed upon his father's heart. Only trust. The innocence of a son rising at dawn to follow his father's steps. Abraham's heart trembled, but he gathered his strength. He held the boy close for a moment longer than usual, breathing in the scent of his hair, feeling the warmth of his small frame. The gesture said what words could not. Sarah, too, stirred within the camp. She looked upon her husband and son with love, unaware of the weight hidden within Abraham's silence. She had walked her own long journey of faith, and now, once again, she would entrust her family to the God who had proven faithful. Abraham's eyes met hers briefly, a glance filled with tenderness, with questions unspoken, with trust unshaken. The small company set out, Abraham leading the donkey, the servants walking behind, and Isaac at his side. Their steps pressed lightly upon the earth, the dust rising softly in their wake. The sun crested the horizon, painting the sky with gold. Their shadows stretched long across the ground. The journey began not with haste, but with stillness. The morning air was cool, but within Abraham's heart a steady fire burned. He carried no map, no clear understanding of how the command would end. Only the word of the Lord. And that was enough. Each step was an act of obedience, each mile a living prayer. His hands carried the knife and the fire. Isaac carried the wood. Together they carried trust. The servants, unaware of the depth of the journey, spoke lightly at first, pointing to distant ridges, naming villages they had passed before, recalling stories of the road. But Abraham's silence soon quieted them, and the group pressed onward in reverent calm. The land unfolded before them, gentle rises of earth, scattered stones, the shimmer of heat already beginning to lift from the ground. Birds circled overhead. The occasional rustle of animals stirred from the brush. All creation seemed to watch as the father of faith walked the road of surrender. Abraham's thoughts turned often toward the promise, the stars he had once been asked to count, the sand upon the seashore he had been told would mirror his descendants. Isaac was the first of those stars, the first grain of sand. Could the promise truly continue if Isaac were taken? Yet faith whispered what reason could not, that God Himself would provide. He did not know how. He did not know when. But He knew who. And that was enough. The morning stretched into afternoon, their pace unhurried but steady. At times Isaac spoke with the lightness of youth, asking questions about the land around them, pointing at the play of light upon the hills. Abraham listened, answered softly, treasured each sound of his son's voice, knowing that every word was a gift. When evening came, they made a small fire, ate bread and drank water together. The servants laughed quietly, speaking of small things. Isaac leaned against his father as the flames flickered, and Abraham wrapped his arm around the boy with tenderness. The stars rose again, countless and bright. Abraham lifted his eyes toward them as he had so many times before. And though the command weighed upon him, he remembered the promise, and he let that promise steady him through the night. The journey would continue with the dawn. The mountain waited ahead. But for now, they rested, father and son, side by side beneath the endless sky. And heaven watched. The God who tests in love, the God who provides in mercy, the God who would meet them on the mountain. The journey stretched forward, each step a quiet act of surrender. Abraham walked at the front, steady and unhurried. Isaac kept close beside him, his youthful stride light. The donkey plodded under the weight of wood and provisions, and the two young servants followed behind, their voices hushed by the solemnity that seemed to rest upon the road. The path wound through valleys and across ridges, the morning sun warming the earth, the air carrying the scent of dust and wild grasses. Birds darted from shrub to shrub, their wings flashing in the light. Small streams glistened in the distance, carving silver lines through the land. It was an ordinary road. Yet for Abraham every step bore the gravity of heaven's command. He held the fire and the knife, symbols of sacrifice. His hand gripped them firmly, not in defiance, but in obedience. Isaac carried the bundle of wood, his small frame steady under the load. The boy did not complain. He did not falter. He walked with the quiet trust of one who believed in his father completely. Abraham's heart ached with each glance at him. Yet within that ache, faith whispered again, "The Lord will provide." The servants moved faithfully behind, unaware of the burden that pressed upon their master's soul. They thought of the journey as an act of worship, as they had seen before. They did not ask why or what offering would be made. They trusted Abraham's silence, for his life had always been marked by communion with the God who spoke. As the hours unfolded, Abraham's mind turned to the countless times God had spoken into impossibility. The promise of land when he was a wanderer, the promise of descendants when he had no child, the covenant sealed under the canopy of stars, the laughter of Sarah when Isaac was born. Each memory rose like a stone along the path, reminding him of faithfulness past, guiding him toward faithfulness yet unseen. They paused for rest beneath the shade of an acacia tree. The donkey lowered its head to graze. The servants drank from their skins. Isaac sat beside his father, his eyes bright, his questions light. Abraham answered him gently, each word chosen carefully, spoken with love. For he did not know how many more such conversations there would be. The journey resumed. The land began to rise slowly. Hills stretching taller, the horizon shifting as mountains came into view. Abraham's eyes lifted toward the distant heights. His heart stirred. He knew that among those ridges lay the place God had appointed. The mountain of surrender. The altar of trust. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. To the servants he offered directions. To Isaac he offered encouragement. To himself he repeated the unspoken prayer. The Lord will provide. The day lengthened. Shadows shifted across the land. The company pressed onward, their steps sure and steady. By the second evening, their bodies were weary. Yet Abraham's resolve deepened. The long night he had endured before had given birth to a quiet endurance. A willingness to keep walking even when the end remained hidden. They built another small fire as the sky darkened. Bread was broken, water passed from hand to hand. Isaac leaned against his father again, his voice soft with weariness. The servants rested close by, their eyes reflecting the firelight. Abraham lifted his gaze toward the stars once more. Countless lights scattered across the heavens. Each one a reminder of the promise. Each one whispering of descendants yet to come. The third morning dawned clear and bright. The mountain of Moriah stood visible in the distance now. Its ridges rising like a question. Its summit crowned with silence. Abraham's heart knew. This was the place. He turned to the young men who had accompanied him. His voice calm, his words deliberate. Stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go over there. We will worship. And then we will come back to you. The servants nodded, trusting their master's word. They could not see the depth of meaning within it. But Abraham knew. His declaration was both faith and prophecy. We will come back to you. His trust reached beyond what his eyes could see. For he believed that God could raise the promise even from the ashes. And so Abraham placed the wood upon Isaac's back once more. He himself carried the fire and the knife. Together they set their faces toward the mountain. Father and son. Climbing toward the place where heaven's test and heaven's mercy would meet. The servants watched them ascend, unaware of the mystery unfolding. Isaac walked faithfully beside his father, his trust unbroken. Abraham walked with the steady rhythm of obedience, his heart surrendered. And above them, unseen yet near, God watched. The provider, the faithful one, the keeper of promises. Ready to reveal what love looks like upon the heights. The ground rose beneath their feet in quiet measure. A steady slope that asked for breath but not hurry. Stones pressed into leather soles. Grasses brushed calves and ankles. The air thinned just enough to make each inhale a mindful thing. Father and son walked within a silence that was not empty. A silence shaped like prayer. Between them the rhythm of steps became a kind of speech. Heel then toe. Heel then toe. A cadence that said more than words could hold. The wood lay across the boy's shoulders, balanced with care. The fire and the knife rested in the father's hands, carried as one carries a vow. The mountain gathered them upward, gathering also every thought that rose and fell within their chests. Birds circled in slow arcs against a high blue sky, their shadows skimming across rock and scrub like passing thoughts. Far below, the servants grew small. The donkey a patient dot near a cluster of stones. The world narrowed to the slope and the sky and the space between two beating hearts. Silence deepened as they climbed. Not the silence of distance, but of nearness so complete it required nothing else. Isaac's breath came steady, youthful but intent. Abraham's breath matched it. Older, heavier, but sure. Each breath a thread, weaving father and son to the same unseen center. Wind drifted over the ridge and down the path, carrying the faint resin of cedar and the clean scent of sun-warmed rock. The firepot tucked within Abraham's cloak answered with a muffled whisper when the breeze touched it. A coal shifting, a hush of ember. The knife at his belt pressed cool and certain against his side. Not a threat, not an argument, only the clear line of obedience drawn through the day. In the quiet, memory moved with them. Earlier mornings at the edge of camp when small hands learned to tie simple knots. Afternoons when laughter chased gazelles along a distant rim of pasture. Evenings when stories braided time together beside a fire. Abraham let each memory pass before him like lambs through a gate. Counted not to cling, but to bless. He released them one by one into the same hands that held this hour. Isaac watched the sky as they climbed, tracing shapes in the bright distance that only young eyes can find. A lion sleeping in a ridge. A ship sailing the air where two clouds met. He stooped once to lift a smooth stone and turned it in his palm, then placed it carefully upon a little cairn others had made before them. A small courtesy to pilgrims unseen. Then he moved on, the weight of wood rebalancing across his shoulders with a shrug that knew the measure of trust more than the measure of burden. They reached a shelf of rock broad enough to stand together and look out. The land unfurled beneath them in patient folds. Valleys like open hands. Streams stitching silver into the earth. Tents far away no larger than seeds scattered by the wind. Abraham felt the old ache stir and then steady. He let the view be what it was, wide and good, and did not wrestle it into an argument. He had done his wrestling in the night. Now he walked, simply and entirely. Silence continued its gentle work. It gathered up stray fears and softened their edges. It gathered up stray hopes and rooted them deeper. It gathered father and son into the same shape of trust. Not identical. Not even spoken. Simply shared. There are hours when love is a word and hours when love is a way of walking. This was the latter. A hawk broke from a crag with a single clean fold of wing and vanished across the sunlight. The sound of it was almost nothing. Yet the air felt marked by the passage. So too the moments they climbed. Almost nothing to the mountain. And yet heaven measured each step as treasure. They passed a thicket where thorn and vine were woven tight. The kind of place where a small animal might hide. The leaves trembled slightly, then held their stillness as the travelers moved by. Abraham's eyes paused on the tangle as one pauses on a word not yet understood. Then he turned again to the upward path. The slope steepened. The boy shifted the wood again and found his stride. The father adjusted the cloak around the firepot and felt the coal's warmth against his ribs. In the warmth there was a mercy. A reminder that what was needed would not fail before it was asked. They came to a narrow run of stones where the path threaded between two shoulders of granite. Feet had gone this way before. The dust compacted. The edges worn smooth. Abraham placed his steps exactly where the ground confessed safe passage. Isaac matched them without effort. Like this, trust moves from one generation to the next. Not as a speech alone, but as footprints that show where the ground holds. Beyond the cleft the wind fell away and the quiet grew even more complete. They could hear the tick of heat inside the rocks. The faint shiver of a grass blade against another. The small dry music of the world when it listens. The mountains seemed to bow around them. Not to menace, but to make room. Isaac's shadow lay alongside Abraham's shadow. The two shapes touching, parting, touching again as the path curved. At times the taller shadow seemed to shelter the smaller. At times the smaller moved a step ahead and pulled the longer forward. The sun wrote their story without ink, and the mountain read it without comment. A cluster of low junipers offered a breath of shade. They stood within it for a little while. Not to rest, but to receive the simple kindness shade always is. Abraham let his hand rest for a moment upon the wood across Isaac's shoulders. Not to take it. Not to lift it. Only to bless what the boy carried and the way he carried it. Then he withdrew the hand and they moved on. The summit seemed closer now. Though mountains keep their own counsel about distance. The ground changed from dusty path to a skin of pebbled stone. Firmer. Spare. Honest. The kind of ground on which altars are made. Abraham felt the knowledge without naming it. He let it settle in him as a stone settles after a river sets it down. In the silence there was also a conversation. Heart to heart. Abraham's within him. And the one who called speaking without sound. Not new instructions. Not rescinding the road. Only the steady presence that has always been the true command. I am with you. The words were not words. yet they filled the space where fear might have lived. Isaac breathed deeper as the climb demanded it, and the depth made him aware of the scent of ash that clung to the wrapped ember at his father's side. He glanced at it once, then returned his gaze to the line of the path, accepting without strain what he did not yet ask. The time for asking would come, but not within this perfect hush. A cricket sprang from shade to sun and stilled. A lizard flashed and disappeared into a slit of rock. The world kept offering little proof that life knows how to move through narrow places without panic. The travelers received the lesson without making a lesson of it. Abraham's thoughts turned toward the name he had spoken in so many kinds of weather. On plains and in doorways and under foreign roofs. The name sat upon his tongue like water ready to be poured. Yet he kept it within, not as a withholding, but as a keeping. There are moments when the holiest thing a mouth can do is carry the name unspilled up the mountain. They reached another ledge and paused again. The view widened. The wind changed. Somewhere above, the path would make its last turn and open to the place chosen before they began. The father felt it the way a sailor feels land before seeing harbor. The son felt only the nearness of his father and the certainty of his step. It was enough. Silence had done its work by then. It had shaped their courage without noise. It had tempered the will the way heat tempers iron. It had given the soul a room large enough for obedience to stand up without breaking. They stepped from the ledge and the slope eased. The summit's shoulder welcomed them. Not with grandeur, but with a simple clarity of space. Here the stones lay close to the surface. Here the wind moved in clean lines. Here the earth felt honest as an open palm. Abraham looked at the ground where an altar could be raised. Stones near at hand. Level space enough for ordering wood. Distance enough from the drop to give room for reverence. He did not begin his work yet. He let the stillness speak one measure more. Isaac shifted the wood from his shoulders and set it down carefully. The mark of it remained upon his tunic like the shadow of a branch after light has moved on. He straightened, drew a long breath, and stood within the quiet as if listening to the same unspoken presence that had held his father all the way up. Between them no words were required. Between them everything had been said by the way they walked. The silence that had accompanied them to this place did not press or ache now. It rested. It opened. It made room for what must come next. The sun leaned toward afternoon. The air grew bright without glare. The mountain kept its watch. Father and son stood together, and the space between their breaths felt like a sanctuary. In that sanctuary obedience waited without haste. Provision waited without announcement. Mercy waited without spectacle. The silence had carried them to the threshold where heaven would soon speak aloud. For now it remained gentle and whole. The final gift of the climb. the last soft cover over a mystery about to be revealed. They stood a little longer, not delaying, simply honoring the path that had brought them here. Then, with hands that had learned to do holy work without trembling, Abraham bent toward the stones. And the next part of the story began to gather itself from the quiet, piece by piece, exactly as love had planned it from the first call beneath the stars. The mountain stood still around them, its rocky shoulders holding the silence like a vessel. Father and son breathed within that stillness, one carrying the command, the other carrying trust untested. Together they stepped further onto the summit. And in that place Abraham's voice broke the hush. Not in complaint, not in protest, but in faith. He turned to the young men who had accompanied them to the foot of the slope. His words had been measured carefully, spoken with the weight of both truth and hope. Stay here with the donkey, while the boy and I go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. The servants bowed their heads, their obedience simple, their understanding shallow. They saw only a father and a son carrying wood and fire. They could not see the unseen mercy waiting among the thickets of the mountain. They could not hear the echo of God's faithfulness that whispered behind Abraham's steady words. But Abraham knew. He had spoken what his heart believed even as it trembled. We will come back to you. Oi! This was not denial of the command, nor a careless hope. It was faith speaking in prophecy. For Abraham trusted that the God who had given Isaac miraculously would not end the promise with his loss. If the sacrifice must be made, then God would raise him up. If the offering must be given, then God would restore it. The covenant would not die upon this mountain. Isaac carried the wood upon his shoulders once more. The burden heavy, but not resisted. His father carried the fire and the knife. Symbols of worship carried not with ease, but with reverence. Together they walked away from the servants, away from the donkey, away from the security of numbers, into the quiet of the appointed place where only faith could stand. The path narrowed as they approached the summit, rocks sharp beneath their sandals, wind pressing cool against their faces. The silence stretched between them, and yet within it lived a trust unspoken. At last, Isaac's young voice broke the stillness. Clear, innocent, piercing as a question that cannot be ignored. Father. Abraham turned. His reply was simple, tender. Yes, my son. Isaac looked at the wood on his back, at the fire in his father's hand, at the knife gleaming faintly in the light. Then he lifted his eyes with the honesty of a child who seeks truth from the one he trusts most. The fire and the wood are here. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? The words fell into Abraham's heart like a blade and a balm together. The innocence of the question pierced him. The trust in his son's voice held him steady. How could he answer without breaking? How could he speak without trembling? Yet the faith that had carried him from yore, the faith that had counted stars in the night sky, rose again upon his lips. God Himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. The words were not pretense. They were prophecy, spoken from a heart that believed what it could not yet see. The same God who had given life from barrenness, who had brought laughter from despair, who had called Abraham his friend, would not abandon them now. Isaac listened, and in the way of a son who trusts his father, he asked no further questions. He accepted the answer. He accepted the mystery. He carried the wood still, and walked beside his father up the slope of the mountain. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It carried the weight of promise. It carried the rhythm of trust. It carried the unseen certainty that God was already preparing the provision Abraham had spoken of. Above them the sky stretched wide, a dome of faithfulness that had never failed. Around them the mountains stood as witness. Below them the servants waited, unaware. And between them, father and son, trust walked in quiet step toward the place where heaven and earth would meet. Each footfall pressed into the stone a testimony that obedience does not end with clarity, but continues in mystery. That faith is not proven in the absence of questions, but in the presence of surrender. The summit drew closer, the stones ready for an altar, the thicket waiting with its secret of mercy. Abraham's heart steady, Isaac's trust whole. The mountain breathed around them as though it knew. The God who had called them here was already here, and His plan was unfolding with every step. They reached the level ground near the summit, a clearing held in the mountain's quiet like a cup in a careful hand. Stones lay close to the surface here, rounded by seasons, firm, clean, ready for holy work. Abraham paused and let his gaze settle upon the place, measuring not with a builder's eye alone, but with a worshipper's heart. He felt the stillness receive them, and in that stillness he bent to begin. His hands chose the first stone, not the largest, not the most impressive, but one that fit the palm with honest weight. He set it down with care, and the soft knock of rock upon rock sounded like a low note in a psalm. Isaac watched, then knelt beside him. The boy's hands, smaller but eager, reached for another stone. Together they began, not with hurry, not with noise, but with a quiet reverence that made the building itself an offering. Stone upon stone, they lifted, They placed. They adjusted. Abraham aligned each piece so the surface would hold the wood without wobble. He tested for steadiness with the heel of his hand. Isaac mirrored him, learning by watching. His breath came a touch faster with the work, but his movements remained gentle. Between them, no explanations were given, no debates. Their labor became its own language, a dialogue of trust spoken in the grammar of obedience. The altar rose slowly, a low square of fitted rock, as ancient as faith and as new as this morning's light. Abraham felt the pull in his shoulders, the slight ache in back and thigh that comes with lifting what is solid and unwilling to be rushed. The ache steadied him, kept his body present while his spirit leaned into God. Each motion was prayer without words. Each placement of stone was a yielding. Each small correction a whispered, "Here I am offered again." Isaac's face held the open calm of youth, the kind that does not ignore weight, but meets it with clear eyes. He glanced now and then toward his father, taking from the older man's silence the rule of this hour. A trust passed between them, not as a command, but as a gift. When the altar stood to its modest height, Abraham ran his palm along the top, feeling the seams, making small adjustments. He nodded, a quiet assent that the foundation was true. Then he turned to the wood. Isaac lifted the bundle from where he had laid it at the start. The marks of the load had pressed faintly across his tunic, shadows of weight already given. He loosened the cords and handed the pieces one by one. Abraham arranged them with care, crosswise, then lengthwise, leaving channels for air, leaving room for flame. He did not stack them as a man in haste, but as one who honors what the fire would mean. The resin in the wood released its scent when a knot met the edge of another piece, a sweet breath rising into the afternoon. The breeze carried it across the ridge and back again, as if the mountain itself were praying with them. Abraham reached within his cloak and drew out the small vessel that held the living ember from the journey's fire. He cupped it with both hands for a moment, feeling its warmth, remembering nights of old when a single coal had kept watch over an entire camp's readiness for flame. He set it near the altar, not yet upon the wood. The time for flame would wait upon the time for surrender. He stood then and looked upon all that was prepared. The altar, true and patient. The wood, ordered and ready. The fire, living but restrained. The knife, still sheathed, its edge hidden like a line not yet read aloud. Silence settled again, deeper now. Not the silence of building, but the silence of a heart standing at the threshold where obedience becomes offering. Abraham turned to his son. His eyes rested upon the boy's face. the face that had taught Sarah to laugh again, the face in which he had seen promises become flesh. He let the sight fill him fully. He did not turn away. Isaac did not flinch beneath the gaze. He met it with the same openness with which he had climbed. The question from the ascent still lingered in the air between them. "Where is the lamb?" "Oi!" And the answer still stood like a lamp within the father's voice. "God himself will provide." "Oi!" The lamp burned steady, even as the room of this moment grew more severe. Abraham stepped nearer. His hands, calloused by years of tending herds and pitching tents and lifting stones, rose slowly. Not to seize, not to surprise, but to bless. He touched the boy's head, letting his palm rest there long enough for the blessing to travel the distance words could not cross without breaking. Isaac closed his eyes for a breath's length, receiving what the touch carried. There was a rope coiled near the wood, a simple cord brought for the ordering of sacrifice. Abraham lifted it. His hands moved with the care of one binding a costly gift rather than restraining a struggling will. He looked again to Isaac, and in that look trust made its final passage from one heart to another. The boy stepped forward willingly, not as one dragged, but as one offered. The binding was tender, measured so it would hold yet not wound. Wrists crossed gently, ankles gathered without harshness. Abraham's fingers worked as one who knew knots well. He left space for breath, for dignity, for love. The cord drew tight with a softness that astonished the air. Then came the lifting, careful, reverent. Abraham gathered his son as he had done when Isaac was small and drowsy at day's end. He laid him upon the ordered wood, not roughly, not hastily. The wood received the weight with its own kind of obedience, giving back firmness where the body needed it. Isaac opened his eyes and found his father's face above him. There was no fear in that face, only sorrow washed in trust, only love anchored in God. The boy's chest rose and fell, steady. His gaze held the sky for a moment, the wide blue where once stars had been counted and promises named. Then he returned his eyes to Abraham and was still. Abraham stood at the head of the altar and drew a long breath. The mountain waited. The wind paused. Even the ember, though it glowed, seemed to hush its whisper. He reached for the knife and freed it from its sheath. The light caught the line of its edge, not flashing, only admitting what it was. He lifted his other hand first, the empty one, as if to set the measure of this act in the presence of the one who sees. His lips did not shape a petition, yet his whole being prayed. He remembered every mile of obedience behind him, and offered it as proof that he would not withhold this hour. He remembered every mercy behind him, and leaned upon them as the only ground for what mercy must do next. The knife rested now in his palm. The weight of it was not heavy. The meaning of it was. He raised the hand. Not quickly, not falteringly, but with the steadiness of a heart that has already crossed its river in the night. The moment tightened like a string drawn true across a bow. The world narrowed to a breath. In that breath, love stood at full height. Love of God first. Love of Son not diminished by it, but lifted into the very place where only God can keep what man cannot. Abraham's obedience did not erase his tenderness. It revealed its source. For he believed that the giver of Isaac was the only safe keeper of Isaac. Even here, even now, the sun leaned toward its later hour, laying a warm hand upon stone and skin and wood. A fly traced a small circle, then veered away. A blade of grass bent and righted itself without sound. Time did not break. It held, so that heaven could speak into it. Abraham's arm hovered, the blade answering the light with a thin, bright quiet. He did not look away. He did not harden his heart. He did not numb his feeling to do a hard thing. He stood whole before God, and offered the whole of what he loved, certain that the Holy One would be holy still when this breath ended, certain that promise does not die in the hands of the promiser. The altar bore sun and wood and the nearness of fire. The Father bore surrender and faith and the nearness of tears that did not fall. The mountain bore witness. The sky bore silence. And all of creation leaned as near as it could, waiting for the next word from the one whose words had begun every story that ever learned to trust. Abraham's hand held the line between earth and heaven, not as a power, but as obedience's final gesture. In that held line, everything was present. Promise and command, love and surrender, Father and Son, God and man. The blade did not move forward. The hand did not drop. The moment itself became an altar within the altar, an offering of time to the God who writes rescue at the edge of breath. And still he stood, steady, ready, worship complete in the heart, waiting only for the voice that decides where the sacrifice will fall, upon the promise, or upon the substitute he alone can provide. The hand lingered in the air, the knife poised above the altar. Time stretched thin as a thread. The mountain held its breath. The stones, the air, the sky itself seemed suspended. All of creation leaned close, as if watching the heartbeat of faith at its sharpest edge. Then, the silence broke. Abraham, Abraham. The voice came not from earth, not from memory, but from heaven itself. firm, urgent, clear. A voice that had once called him out of your, that had once led him under stars, that had once spoken laughter into Sarah's womb, now called again, cutting through the moment with mercy. "Here I am," Abraham answered. His hand froze. The knife stilled. His whole body bent toward the sound. The obedience had been real, the surrender complete. But the sacrifice was not required. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. The words fell upon Abraham's heart like rain upon parched soil. The command that had weighed upon him through sleepless nights and heavy days dissolved in a flood of mercy. The boy upon the altar remained untouched. The promise remained alive. Abraham lowered the knife slowly, his hand trembling not with fear, but with awe. His knees nearly gave beneath him. His breath came like a man who has carried a mountain and then set it down. He turned his eyes toward Isaac. The boy's gaze fixed upon him. Steady, trusting, unharmed, alive. The cord still bound his son's hands and feet. Yet in that moment Abraham saw him freer than ever. For Isaac had been given back, not taken. Preserved not by his father's strength but by heaven's command. Abraham bent quickly and untied the ropes. His fingers worked fast, not with panic but with relief that poured like water from a broken jar. The cords fell away. Isaac sat up slowly upon the wood. His breath drew deep. His eyes lifted skyward. He had not struggled when bound, and now he did not tremble when freed. He simply received what had been given. The gift of life restored. The gift of trust made whole. Father and son embraced there upon the stones, their bodies shaking with release, with love, with gratitude. It was not laughter this time. Not yet. But a quiet joy, deeper than sound. The kind of joy that comes when mercy interrupts the sharpest edge. Abraham's ears still rang with the angel's words. You have not withheld your son, your only son. He knew then that the test had not been about Isaac's life, but about the posture of his own heart. Would he cling to the promise more tightly than to the giver? Would he trust God's plan even when it tore at his deepest love? The test had asked the question. His obedience had given the answer. And God had responded with mercy. Isaac looked into his father's eyes, searching for explanation. Abraham's gaze returned steady, filled with a faith that had passed through fire and emerged unconsumed. He whispered no long discourse, no heavy teaching. Only the truth lived out before them both. That God's command is never without His presence. and his presence is never without his mercy. The mountain exhaled. The wind picked up again. The ember at the side of the altar flared briefly, as if creation itself sighed with relief. The sky, which had seemed suspended, opened its blue wide once more. And Abraham knew that the God who tests is the God who provides. The God who asks is the God who gives. The God who calls is the God who keeps. He stood beside his son, both of them steadying one another, both of them marked forever by what had almost been, but was not. The altar stood built. The wood lay arranged. The fire waited. But Isaac was spared. The offering would not come from him, but from another provision already near. The father's obedience had been complete. The son's trust had been pure. And heaven had answered with mercy. Take a long, slow breath here. Feel the weight of surrender releasing. The tension easing. The mercy flowing like cool water across dry ground. As Abraham's hand was stilled, so too may every trembling within you be stilled tonight. For the God who spoke upon Moriah still speaks. Do not be afraid. I am faithful. I will provide. And in that assurance, both father and son stood upon the mountain, no longer in dread, but in the peace of a promise that had proven stronger than the test. The echo of the heavenly voice still lingered, wrapping the mountain in a holiness deeper than silence. Abraham's hand no longer trembled with the weight of the knife. It now trembled with the weight of mercy. His son sat beside him, free, alive. The cords fallen to the earth like old shadows that could not stay. And then Abraham lifted his eyes. There, caught by its horns in a thicket nearby, stood a ram. The animal struggled gently against the branches, its strength restrained. Not by chance, but by providence. Not placed there by human hand, but by the unseen hand of God who provides. Abraham's breath caught in his chest. His eyes filled. For here was the answer. Here was the substitute. Here was the provision he had spoken of to his son upon the climb. God himself will provide the lamb. Oi! And now, upon the mountain, that word had become flesh and wool and horn. Heaven had already prepared what obedience required. He walked toward the thicket slowly, reverently, each step an act of thanksgiving. Isaac followed close, his eyes wide with wonder, his young heart learning in this moment what trust in God truly means. Abraham laid his hand upon the ram's back. The creature stood firm, caught yet calm, as though it, too, had been waiting for this very moment. Abraham untangled it carefully, guiding it toward the altar. His movements were not hurried, but full of awe. The wood remained arranged upon the stones. The ember glowed softly at its side. The fire was ready to receive what heaven had given. Isaac stepped back, his gaze steady upon his father. Abraham lifted the ram and placed it upon the altar. The substitute. The provision. The offering given in place of the son. He kindled the fire. The flame caught quickly, feeding upon the dry wood. The smoke lifted into the clear air, curling skyward in a steady column, carrying with it the fragrance of obedience, of surrender met by mercy. Abraham bowed low, his face close to the ground. His heart poured out in gratitude. He had not withheld his son, and God had not withheld his provision. Isaac stood near, his young frame silhouetted by the rising smoke. His eyes glimmered not with fear, but with awe. He had lain upon the wood. He had felt the cords. He had watched the knife raised. And now he saw the ram in his place, the fire consuming it instead. The truth seared itself into his soul. God provides. The flames rose higher. The smoke climbed. The mountain echoed with a stillness broken only by the crackle of burning wood. It was worship, not of despair, but of trust fulfilled. When the offering was complete, Abraham turned to his son. He drew Isaac into his arms. The embrace was long, fierce with love, tender with relief. They held one another, not as though clinging to what might be lost, but as though celebrating what had been given back. The name of the place pressed itself into Abraham's heart. He would not call it sorrow. He would not call it fear. He would call it what it truly was. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Upon this mountain, God had revealed his nature once more. The God who calls is the God who provides. The God who tests is the God who rescues. The God who asks for surrender is the God who gives back in greater measure. Isaac looked at the altar, at the smoke still curling into the sky, at the ashes of the ram. He would never forget. The memory would walk with him all his days. The lesson would live in his children and his children's children. That God is faithful, even when his ways seem hidden, even when his command feels heavy, even when the heart trembles at the edge of surrender. The mountain itself seemed to breathe out peace. The air cleared. The wind carried away the last strands of smoke. The stones cooled beneath the sun. Heaven's mercy had been revealed in the ram. And father and son stood together, alive, forever changed. Abraham lifted his eyes once more to the sky. His voice rose in quiet thanksgiving. He did not need many words. Only one truth spoken with reverence. The Lord provides. And so Moriah became more than a mountain. It became a testimony. a place where obedience met mercy, where surrender met provision, where faith met fulfillment. As the fire died down, Abraham gathered Isaac to his side. Together they looked upon the altar, no longer a place of dread, but a place of worship. And then they turned their faces toward the path home, carrying with them not sorrow, but the joy of God's faithfulness. The fire on the altar burned low, glowing embers whispering their last song, smoke rising in gentle strands, thinning into the wide sky. The ram's sacrifice was complete, and with it, Abraham's obedience had found its fulfillment. Isaac stood beside his father, the weight of cords no longer upon his wrists, the shadow of the knife no longer above him. He was alive, spared, and yet forever marked by what had just unfolded. Abraham breathed deeply, drawing into his chest the cool mountain air, now cleared of smoke and tension. His eyes lifted upward, not in confusion, not in demand, but in worship. He whispered the name that had been carved into his soul by the mercy he had just witnessed. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. He spoke it not as a passing phrase, but as a name given to the very ground where he stood. A name that would remain forever. A testimony in stone and wind and memory. Whenever future generations would ask about Moriah, they would hear this name, and they would know what had been revealed upon this mountain. Isaac stood quietly, his young heart trying to hold the weight of it all. He had asked his question on the ascent. Where is the lamb? Oi! And now he had seen the answer with his own eyes. The lamb had not been his own life, but the life of the ram God had provided. The lesson etched itself deeply into him. Not with ink, not with chisels, but with the fire of experience. He looked at his father, saw in his face both weariness and peace. Abraham's eyes, though aged and lined with years, shone with a new depth. A settled trust that had passed through the darkest testing and emerged unbroken. Isaac knew he was loved. But more than that, he knew his father loved God above all. And that love had not left him abandoned. They stood together before the altar a long while, not speaking, letting silence do the work that words could not, letting gratitude fill the space between their breaths, letting the mountain itself bear witness to the covenant renewed. At last Abraham placed his hand upon his son's shoulder, a gesture of strength and tenderness. They turned from the altar, the fire now only embers, and began to descend the mountain. Each step downward felt lighter than the ones that had brought them upward. The burden of mystery had lifted, replaced by the certainty of provision. Isaac no longer bore the weight of wood upon his back. Abraham no longer bore the weight of fear within his chest. The path that had been steep with dread was now softened by relief. As they walked, Abraham's heart turned to the promises God had spoken long ago. promises of land, of descendants, of blessing to the nations. He had believed those promises when Isaac was not yet born. And now, with Isaac walking beside him, alive and spared, his faith blazed brighter than ever. The God who had kept his word through the impossible birth of a son had kept his word again through the impossible demand of surrender. Isaac too carried a new understanding. He had been laid upon the wood. He had felt the cords tighten. He had seen the knife raised. And then he had seen mercy descend. The memory would never leave him. It would shape his view of God, his trust in his ways, his understanding that the Lord does not abandon, even when the road seems unbearable. When they reached the place where the servants had waited, the young men rose quickly, their eyes searching the faces of master and son. They saw them both alive, both whole, both carrying a strange, quiet radiance. They did not ask questions. They only bowed their heads, sensing that something holy had passed upon the mountain. Something too deep for easy words. Abraham looked at them with calm assurance. He had said, "We will come back to you." Oi! And now, by God's mercy, his words had been fulfilled. They set their faces toward home. The donkeys' hooves steady upon the path. The sun dipping toward the west. But behind them the mountain stood, bearing its new name, Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. And that name would echo through the generations, carried on the lips of prophets, remembered in the hearts of the faithful, whispered in prayers uttered in times of need. It was more than a name. It was a revelation, a glimpse of God's heart, a foreshadowing of a greater provision yet to come. For one day, upon another hill not far from this one, another son would walk with wood upon his back. Another lamb would be provided, not caught in a thicket, but given freely for the salvation of all. Abraham could not yet see that day. Isaac could not yet imagine it. But heaven already held the plan, already carried the mercy, already prepared the greater sacrifice. And Moriah would stand as a shadow of what was to come. For now, father and son descended together, alive, whole, and bound more deeply than ever by trust in the God who provides. Take a breath with them now. Feel the descent after the climb, the release after the tension, the relief after the testing. Let your soul rest in the name spoken upon the mountain, Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. And may that name steady your heart tonight, just as it steadied Abraham's on the mountain of surrender. The descent had only just begun when the air upon the mountain changed again. A nearness like warm light moving without sound. Abraham paused. Isaac paused with him. And the summit behind them seemed to draw one more breath of heaven. Then the voice came a second time. Not as thunder, not as fire, but as the steady certainty of promise renewed. The messenger of the Lord called Abraham by name, and the name carried on mercy, steadied every trembling place within him. He turned the whole of his attention upward. Heart open, hands open, nothing withheld. For the altar had already taught him how to stand before God with nothing hidden. Blessing flowed then, not as a single word, but as a river, because the obedience had been complete, because the surrender had been real, because love for God had stood above every other love and had discovered there, not loss, but the very source of every gift. The oath was sworn not on earth, but in heaven's own name. A promise bound to the heart of the one who cannot lie. I will surely bless you. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens and as the sand upon the shore. Your seed will possess the gate of their enemies. And through your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Because you have not withheld your son, your only son. Oi! The words settled over the mountain like dew upon grass at dawn. Each phrase found a resting place in Abraham's memory. Each vow reached beyond the day, beyond the hill, into generations unborn. Isaac listened too, the cadence of promise threading into the fabric of his young soul. He did not grasp the breadth of it yet, but he felt its weight, its goodness, its future. And he knew that the God who had spared him now stretched kindness far past his own life. Abraham bowed low where he stood, not to earn what had already been given, but to receive it with reverence. He had learned again that the fear of the Lord is pure, that obedience opens the door where blessing enters, not as payment, but as overflow. He had stood on the brink where love surrenders its dearest and had found, waiting there, the God who gives back with increase. The wind moved softly through the thicket where the ram had been caught. The stones of the altar kept their quiet watch. The last ember faded to a sigh, and upon that fading heat the future glowed brighter than any coal. For the oath had gathered the stars and the sands into a single assurance, that God would keep what he had promised. To Abraham, to Isaac, to children yet only imagined. They began again to descend. But now each step carried the echo of heaven's vow. Abraham's pace was unhurried, the steadiness of a man held by a word larger than himself. Isaac walked a half step nearer than before, as though some invisible bond had drawn them closer. Not the cords of fear, but the cords of mercy. Along the path they passed the places where they had paused earlier in the climb, the narrow cleft smoothed by many feet, the patch of juniper offering its small shade, the shelf of rock where the land had opened wide. Each landmark remembered their silence. Now each received their gratitude. They did not stop to build monuments, for the promise itself would be monument enough, carried in their bones. told by their tongues, lived by their descendants. When they reached the ledge from which the plain spread like an open hand, Abraham lingered and looked out. The world below was unchanged. And yet everything was changed. Fields lay where fields had lain. Streams glimmered where streams had flowed. But the future within those fields and along those streams had been named anew. Nations would be blessed. Gates would be possessed. The story of God and man would move forward through a line mercy had preserved upon a mountain called "The Lord Will Provide." Oi! Isaac turned his face to the wind and let it lift the edge of his tunic and cool the warmth left by the fire's nearness. He knew little of nations and gates, but he knew the feel of his father's hand when it rested upon his shoulder. He knew the firmness of an altar built stone by stone. He knew the tenderness with which ropes can be tied and untied when love governs the knot. He knew that God had seen him upon the wood and had given him back. These knowings were enough for today. The larger knowing would grow with the years like a tree planted by water. They came at last to the place where the servants waited. The young men rose quickly, surprise and relief widening their eyes at the sight of both father and son. The donkey flicked its ears and breathed a patient cloud into the light. Abraham nodded. Not to explain, but to bless. And the small company turned toward home. On the path the promise walked with them, sometimes as quiet as a thought held behind the ribs, sometimes as steady as a song heard beneath daily noises. When the road dipped, they felt it like a hand upon the back. When the road rose, they felt it like strength within the knees. It asked nothing frantic of them, only that they remember. And remembering, live as those already held by a future God himself had sworn to keep. Abraham's mind traveled through the words again. Stars, sand, gates, nations. Each image opened into another. Stars too many to count. Nights when descendants would lift their own eyes and hear the same invitation to trust. Sand that could not be gathered in a single hand. Mornings when children's children would play at the edges of promised shores. Gates once closed standing open. Strongholds yielding to a peace not born of swords but of covenant. Nations receiving a blessing meant for all the families of earth. He did not rush ahead to make these things happen by cleverness. He did what faith always does after hearing God speak. He walked. He kept house with hope. He tended the ordinary with reverence. For promises are not fragile glass to be guarded in a case. They are living seeds to be carried through the day. Planted with patience. Entrusted to the God who gives growth in his time. Isaac glanced now and then at his father, and found the same quiet he had known since childhood, but deeper, wider, as though a river had been joined by another at some bend upstream. He could not name the confluence, but he felt its strength underfoot. The boy's step found new music in it, a cadence that would carry into his own manhood, into wells dug and tents pitched, into blessings spoken over sons yet to be born. They camped that night upon gentle ground. The servants prepared a small meal, bread warmed upon a flat stone, water poured, a fire lit without the urgency of test. Abraham looked into the flames and saw not the edge of a knife but the soft face of promise reflecting back. He lifted a piece of bread and broke it. His hands remembered what it means to offer, and now they remembered what it means to receive again. Sleep came easily, not because the day had been simple, but because God had been faithful within its severity. The stars laid their silent choir above them, and somewhere among those lights Abraham's eyes found again the ones he had tried to count years before. He smiled, not to master the number, but to rest in the joke that had become truth. There would be more than he could measure, because the one who promised had sworn by his own name. At dawn they rose. The road home waited without drama. The tents they knew would receive them. Sarah's laughter would rise again at the sight of Isaac returning with his father. Servants would return to ordinary labors, animals to familiar pastures. But ordinary would never again mean small. Not after Moriah. Not after the oath. Every small thing now shimmered with participation in a larger mercy. So they walked on, wrapped in a promise that had passed through fire and not burned. The mountain behind them bore its new name like a banner over the plain. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. And the future before them wore the brightness of a vow heaven would not forget. Let the heart rest here, in the hush that follows God's assurance. Trust does not end when the blade is stayed. It goes on into the long daylight of kept promises, into cooking fires and folded tents, into greetings at thresholds and laughter spilling from doorways. Faith is not only the climb, it is the return, lived beneath a name that cannot fail. Take a slow breath, and another, as Abraham did when the voice spoke blessing over sacrifice withheld. Let the promise that held him hold you too. The one who swore by himself still watches over every road home, still multiplies what seems small, still opens gates no hand can force, still carries blessing outward until it touches lives and lands far beyond our knowing. And under such a vow, sleep comes gently. For the God who calls, provides, and promises, also keeps watch. From the mountain to the doorstep, from the altar to the quiet bed, from this night into every morning yet to come. The mountain faded into the distance behind them, but its lesson did not fade. It lived now in Abraham's heart like fire that does not consume, only warms. It lived in Isaac's memory like a mark upon the soul, invisible yet indelible. Each step away from Moriah was also a step into a deeper knowing that God's ways are higher than man's, that His mercy weaves even through the most bewildering of commands. The plain stretched wide before them, the horizon painted with the soft gold of afternoon. Dust rose gently beneath the donkey's hooves. The servants walked quietly at a respectful distance. Neither asked for explanation, though their eyes lingered now and then upon Isaac, as if to confirm that he was truly there. Alive. Whole. Walking beside his father. Abraham's face was calm, though lined with the weight of years and the memory of the altar. His hand rested often upon Isaac's shoulder, not to steady the boy, but to remind himself of the miracle of his presence. For every step Isaac took was a testimony, a living witness that God had provided. Isaac himself walked lightly, but within him something had changed. He had seen the wood upon the altar, felt the cords upon his hands, watched the knife lifted, and then heard the angel's voice. He had seen the ram, the fire, the smoke. He had learned, in a way no child could ever forget, that God's provision is not theory, but reality. He did not yet grasp the fullness of covenant or prophecy, but he understood trust in a new way. As father and son walked together, their shadows stretched long upon the earth, side by side, touching and parting with each step. The bond between them was stronger than before, not because the trial had been easy, but because they had walked through it together. Abraham had trusted God with his son, and Isaac had trusted his father with his life. Trust layered upon trust, love braided upon love. When they camped for the night, the stars rose once more above them. Abraham looked upward, as he had so many times before. But this time the stars felt nearer, each one a reminder of God's oath upon the mountain, each one a sign that the promise would not fail. His heart, once tested to breaking, now rested in a peace deeper than understanding. Isaac lay beside him, drifting towards sleep. He had no words for what he felt, only the memory of his father's steady gaze, the sound of the angel's voice, the sight of the ram in the thicket. He closed his eyes with the quiet knowledge that his life was not his own. It had been spared, preserved, given back, and that meant it belonged to God. Abraham lay awake a little longer. His thoughts moved through years past and years to come. He remembered the day God first called him beneath another sky, the day he had laughed with Sarah over the miracle of a son, the long journey to Moriah, the altar, the knife, the voice. And now, the promise renewed, the covenant unbroken. He felt older, yet lighter, emptied, yet full, surrendered, yet secure. The servants tended the small fire until it burned to embers. The donkey shifted and settled into the earth. The night closed gently around them. Abraham finally allowed his eyes to rest. And sleep came. Not troubled by fear, but wrapped in trust. Morning rose again. The plain ahead bright with promise. The road home stretched before them. Familiar and yet new. For they were not the same as when they had left. They carried with them not only wood and embers, not only memory and relief, but a revelation. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. That name walked with them. It whispered with every footstep. It lingered in the rhythm of breath. It sang in the silence of their return. And it would not be forgotten. Not by Abraham. Not by Isaac. Not by the generations that would follow. The return to Sarah's tent was tender. She lifted her eyes and saw them coming from afar. Her heart leapt. Isaac at her husband's side. Alive. Unharmed. She ran forward, laughter rising again from the depths of her being. Isaac folded into her embrace. Abraham stood close, his eyes wet with gratitude. The family held one another, and the camp rejoiced. For the God who had given laughter once had given it again. Life resumed. Animals tended. Water drawn. Bread baked upon stones. Yet beneath every ordinary task, a new depth of trust breathed. The altar upon Moriah had taught them that even the dearest could be surrendered. And even in surrender, God's mercy is greater. Abraham no longer clung to Isaac as though his love could protect him. He held him with the open hands of faith, knowing that the God who had given him once could give him again. That the God who had spared him upon the mountain would keep him through every valley. And Isaac, as he grew, carried the memory like a seed. Not heavy with fear, but alive with faith. He had learned early that life itself is gift. That obedience may test, but never destroys what God intends to fulfill. That lesson would mark him, guide him, shape him, and through him the covenant would continue. The days ahead would be many, and the story of Moriah would live within their lineage forever. Retold at firesides, remembered in worship, echoed in the names of places and the faith of children yet unborn. A story not of terror, but of trust, not of loss, but of provision, not of death, but of life preserved. And so the mountain faded from view, but its name remained, Jehovah Jireh. And the household of Abraham carried that truth into every step of their journey. Take a long breath here. Let it steady your heart as it steadied theirs. Release the weight you cling to, and let it fall into the hands of the one who provides. He is faithful upon the mountain, faithful upon the plain, faithful in the climb, faithful in the return. And tonight, as you rest, may you know in your own soul what Abraham knew on Moriah: that nothing surrendered to God is ever truly lost, and that His provision will always meet you at the moment you need it most. The camp had returned to its rhythms. Fires lit at dawn. Herds led to pasture. Water jars lifted and filled at the well. Laughter from children weaving through the tents. Yet beneath the surface of daily life something permanent had changed. Abraham carried within him the certainty of Moriah. Isaac carried within him the memory of being spared. And the household itself lived under the quiet banner of a new name: Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Abraham's voice carried more weight when he spoke to his servants. Not because it was louder, but because it was steadier. When he reminded them of God's faithfulness, they listened differently now. For though they had not walked to the altar with him, they had seen him return with his son. They had seen with their own eyes that trust in God was not in vain. Sarah too listened when Abraham spoke. She saw Isaac growing taller each season, his laughter carrying further, his step more sure. She knew what had nearly been. She knew what mercy had done. Her laughter now was richer, fuller, for it rose from a heart that understood the cost of joy. Isaac carried the story quietly. He did not boast about it, did not turn it into a tale to impress friends. It lived in him more like a seed buried deep, watered by remembrance, waiting to bear fruit in time. When he lay awake at night, he sometimes saw again the wood, the knife, the ram. But the memory did not haunt him. It steadied him. For he knew that God had seen him upon the altar and had given him back. The covenant stretched forward like a path, not only for Abraham, not only for Isaac, but for children not yet born, for generations yet to come. The God who had sworn by his own name would keep his word across centuries, carrying his promise through trials, through deserts, through nations and kings, until the fullness of blessing touched every family of earth. Abraham would teach Isaac to dig wells, to tend herds, to honor guests with hospitality. But more than these, he would teach him to trust. For trust was the treasure Moriah had sealed within them both. Trust that the God who commands is the God who provides. Trust that surrender does not destroy, but opens the door for mercy. Trust that when all seems lost, God Himself writes the rescue. The story of Moriah began to ripple outward. Servants whispered it in or around fires. Travelers carried fragments of it in their tales. Neighboring tribes heard that the God of Abraham was unlike any other. A God who tests, yet also provides. A God who asks for all, yet gives back with greater abundance. And heaven too held the story close. For Moriah was not the end. It was a shadow of something greater. A glimpse forward to a day when another son would climb another hill. wood upon his shoulders, submission in his heart. But this time there would be no ram caught in a thicket, no voice to stay the hand, no substitute but himself. Abraham could not see that day in full. Isaac could not imagine it. But the God who provides had already written it into the fabric of time. The mercy shown upon Moriah was a foretaste of the mercy that would one day cover the whole world. And so the covenant deepened. Abraham trusted that his descendants would inherit the promise. Isaac trusted that his life belonged to the God who had spared him. And the generations yet to come would walk in the shadow of this mountain's truth, repeating its name as comfort in their own trials. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Evenings in the camp were never ordinary again. When the fire burned low and stars filled the sky, Abraham sometimes told Isaac of the God who had first spoken to him beneath distant constellations. How he had been called to leave his homeland. How he had walked into unknown lands. How every promise had seemed impossible until it became real. And now, Isaac knew firsthand what it meant to trust when the way seemed unbearable. The boy listened with a seriousness beyond his years. His eyes wide, his heart open. He did not always speak. But he remembered. He remembered the wood on his back, his father's steady hands, the voice from heaven, the ram in the thicket. And he understood that his life was bound to God's promise in ways deeper than he could yet put into words. As the years passed, Abraham grew older. His beard whiter, his step slower. But the fire within him did not dim. For he had seen too much of God's faithfulness to doubt now. Every sunrise reminded him of the God who brings light after darkness. Every star reminded him of descendants yet to come. Every breath Isaac took reminded him that God had provided. And Isaac, watching his father age, carried the story forward in his own strength. He took upon himself the responsibility of the covenant. Not because it was demanded, but because it had been revealed in mercy. He knew that his life was not his own, and that through him, God's promise would live on. The name of the mountain traveled with them always. It was spoken in prayer, whispered in gratitude, remembered in moments of fear. And each time it was spoken, it carried not only memory but power. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Take a slow breath here, and let the truth of Moriah settle into your own soul. The God who provided for Abraham and Isaac is the same God who watches over you tonight. His provision may not always look as expected. His timing may not always match your desire. But His mercy never fails. His love never wavers. His promise never breaks. Let your heart rest in that assurance, that the one who provided then will provide now, and tomorrow, and always. Time moved forward. Seasons turned. Fields ripened and were gathered. flocks multiplied and grazed upon the hills. The tents of Abraham's household shifted with the rhythms of pasture and water. Yet through all these changes, one thing remained constant. The promise of God, spoken and reaffirmed, now shining even brighter after the test of Moriah. Abraham often sat at the entrance of his tent in the cool of evening. The light fading, the sky filling with stars. And he would recall the voice from heaven. Because you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. Oi. These words lived in him now as deeply as breath. They were not fragile, to be feared as though they might vanish. They were firm, stronger than stone, more enduring than time itself. Isaac, growing taller each year, carried himself with quiet strength. The memory of the mountain was still within him, but it did not cast a shadow of fear. It cast a light of trust. He had seen the knife raised. He had heard the angel's voice. He had seen the ram caught in the thicket. And he knew that his life had been spared for a purpose greater than himself. At night, by the fireside, the servants often leaned in to hear Abraham speak. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of lived faith. He told of leaving Ur, of pitching tents in lands unknown, of building altars where God had appeared, of promises spoken under starlight, of laughter born from barren wombs. And now, when he spoke of Moriah, he did so with tears in his eyes and gratitude in his voice. He did not glorify his obedience. He glorified God's provision. The younger ones in the camp would whisper of it in awe. He was to be offered. But God provided a ram. The story passed among them not as rumor, but as testimony. And each telling carried with it the name of the mountain. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Sarah too treasured the return of her son. She watched Isaac with a mother's joy, saw him grow into manhood, saw his laughter fill the camp as it had filled her tent when first he was born. She knew what it meant to almost lose him. And so every day she had with him was doubled in sweetness. As Isaac grew, Abraham guided him gently into the weight of covenant, teaching him how to build altars, how to call on the name of the Lord, how to live not by sight, but by trust in the God who speaks. Isaac did not resist, for he had seen with his own eyes that the God of his father was faithful. And Abraham's household prospered, not merely in herds or wealth, but in peace, in the assurance that their lives were folded into the purposes of God. Travelers who passed through their camp would often pause and marvel at the order, the kindness, the blessing that seemed to rest upon every tent and pasture. Some would ask about it, and the story of Moriah would be told again, always ending with the same name, Jehovah Jireh. The years began to show more heavily upon Abraham. His hair whitened fully. His step slowed. His hands, once strong for lifting stone and staff, grew gentler. But his eyes shone with a brightness that did not fade. For he had seen too much of God's mercy to let doubt find any place. Isaac watched his father closely, learning not only from his words but from his quiet. From the way Abraham prayed in silence at dawn. From the way he paused before every decision to seek the Lord's presence. From the way his laughter came even in old age, a laughter born of faith, not foolishness. The promise stretched forward. It was bigger than Abraham, bigger than Isaac, bigger than all they could see. But they trusted that the God who had begun it would bring it to fulfillment. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, Abraham would glance at his son sleeping nearby, and tears would gather in his eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but of gratitude. For he remembered the altar. He remembered the knife. And he remembered the voice that stayed his hand. Each breath Isaac took was a reminder that God provides. He did not cling to his son in fear of losing him. He held him openly, trusting that the God who had given Isaac once and spared him once would keep him always. This freedom of faith gave Abraham peace, and gave Isaac space to grow. And Isaac did grow, strong in body, steady in spirit. He was not a boy carried by his father's faith alone. He was becoming a man with faith of his own, shaped by the memory of Moriah, nourished by the teaching of his father, rooted in the promise of God. The covenant had not ended upon that mountain. It had only deepened. And now its weight was passing gently, firmly, into the hands of the next generation. The name of the mountain remained upon their lips. Whispered in prayer, spoken in blessing, remembered in silence. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. And so their days unfolded with a quiet assurance. For every sunrise was a reminder of provision. Every star a reminder of promise. Every breath a reminder of mercy. Take a long, slow breath here, and let the truth of their story become the truth of your own. The God who provided for Abraham and Isaac provides still. His promises remain. His mercy endures. His love does not fail. Rest in that tonight, as Abraham did beneath the stars, as Isaac did beside the altar, as generations have ever since, in the steady assurance of the God who provides. The story of Moriah did not remain upon the mountain. It began to ripple outward, carried first upon the lips of Abraham's household, then into the memory of generations. Servants spoke of it with awe. Children repeated it with wide eyes around evening fires. Travelers heard whispers of it when they passed through Abraham's camp. And everywhere the name of that place was spoken, one truth shone clear. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Isaac carried the story deep within his soul, not as something to be told lightly, but as something to be lived. Each time he built an altar of his own, he remembered the stones upon Moriah. Each time he laid wood in careful order, he remembered the wood beneath his back. Each time he lifted his voice to pray, he remembered the voice that had called his name through the silence. The memory shaped him quietly. It gave him patience when the wells he dug were stopped by envious neighbors. It gave him strength when famine touched the land. It gave him courage when he needed to lead his household in the path of covenant. For Isaac knew that his life itself was a gift preserved by God's hand. And if the Lord had spared him once, he would not abandon him now. Abraham too carried the memory as a treasure. He was no longer a man restless for proof. He was a man at rest in the God who had already proven himself faithful. He still pitched tents. He still moved with his flocks. But in his heart he lived always within the shadow of Moriah's mercy. That mountain was never far from him. Not because of fear, but because of the joy of God's provision. As the years turned, Abraham often told the story to Isaac in fuller measure. Not every detail all at once, but in gentle pieces. Sometimes when the stars glittered bright above them, he would remind Isaac of the promise God had sworn. That his descendants would be as countless as those lights. And then he would speak softly of the day when it seemed the promise would vanish upon an altar. And how God had given it back. Stronger than before. Isaac listened. Not with childish wonder anymore, but with the understanding of a man growing into his own place in the covenant. The story no longer frightened him. It steadied him. It became a foundation. A root that went deep and nourished his own faith. The camp itself became a place marked by unusual peace. Visitors noticed it. A calmness seemed to rest over the tents, as though unseen hands guarded them. Strangers sometimes asked, "Why does blessing rest here?" And Abraham would point not to his wealth, nor to his skill, but to the God who provides. The name of the mountain spread. Jehovah Jireh. And with it spread a testimony that the God of Abraham was unlike the gods of the nations. Their idols demanded endlessly and gave nothing. But the Lord asked for surrender, and then gave back in mercy. Their idols devoured the lives of men. But the Lord preserved life and promised blessing. Isaac, when he prayed, often used the name Jehovah Jireh. Each time he said it, he remembered wood, fire, knife, altar, and ram. And each time, the memory became not heavy, but light. Not wound, but strength. For he knew he belonged to the God who provides. And though neither Abraham nor Isaac could see it, heaven was already writing a greater story. For one day another hill would rise. Another son would walk with wood upon his shoulders. Another life would be laid down. But this time there would be no ram in the thicket. This time the Lamb of God himself would be the offering. Moriah was a shadow of Calvary. A foretaste of the greater mercy yet to come. Abraham's obedience foreshadowed the father's love. Isaac's surrender foreshadowed the son's willingness. The ram foreshadowed the final lamb who takes away the sin of the world. Generations would pass. Kings would rise and fall. Prophets would speak and be silenced. Yet always, the story of Moriah would remain. A beacon of trust in the God who provides. And when the greater provision came, those who knew the old story would recognize its fulfillment. They would see upon the cross the same truth revealed anew. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Abraham's life continued quietly after Moriah. He tended his herds. He buried Sarah with love and honor. He arranged for Isaac's marriage so that the promise might continue. He grew older, but his faith did not grow weaker. It grew brighter, like a lamp nearing the end of its oil yet burning with steady flame. Isaac stepped more fully into manhood, carrying the covenant as his own. His prayers were his own now, his trust his own. Yet always within him lived the memory of the mountain, and the name that defined it, Jehovah Jireh. And so the story lived on, not only as history, but as prophecy, not only as memory, but as promise. The Lord who provided upon Moriah would provide again, in every generation, until the day the greatest provision was given once and for all. Take a breath here, and let the truth of this story settle into your own heart. The God who provided for Abraham, the God who spared Isaac, the God who prepared a ram in the thicket, is the same God who sees you now, who provides for your need, who has already given the lamb for your salvation. Rest tonight in that assurance that his provision is not only for long ago mountains, but for your life here and now, and for every tomorrow yet to come. The years turned like pages in a book already written, each one carrying Abraham closer to the completion of his journey. His hair grew white as desert lilies in bloom. His steps slowed like a river nearing the sea. His hands, once strong for lifting stones and pitching tents, grew softer with age. But his heart remained steady, steady as it had been upon Moriah, steady as it had been beneath the stars when God first spoke promise over him. The story of the mountain was never far from his thoughts, not because it bound him in fear, but because it freed him in trust. He had seen the sharp edge of surrender, and he had seen the merciful hand of God stay it. He had lifted the knife, and he had lowered it again at heaven's command. He had heard the voice of provision. He had seen the ram. He had named the place Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. And that truth became the ground beneath his every step in the years that followed. Isaac remained at his side, no longer a boy, but a man growing into the covenant. He carried the story of Moriah quietly within him, a story too holy to be spoken lightly, but one that shaped every prayer, every altar, every decision. He knew his life had been spared, and he knew why. It was not because his father had faltered. It was because God had provided. And so Isaac's faith grew steady, rooted deep in the soil of mercy. Sarah too had aged. She watched her son with eyes that never tired of beholding him. For she had laughed at his birth, and she had nearly wept at his loss. But mercy had restored him, and so her laughter had returned, richer and truer than before. She carried that laughter with her into her final days. And when at last she was gathered to rest, Abraham laid her in the cave at Machpelah, a resting place purchased as a sign that the land promised by God would belong to his descendants. In his grief, Abraham found strength in the same God who had given and spared Isaac. He grieved as any man grieves, but he did not grieve as one without hope, for he knew that God's promise stretched even beyond the grave. Time moved on. Abraham grew older still. He saw Isaac wed Rebekah. He saw his household flourish. He saw God's blessing ripple outward into the lives of his servants and neighbors. He watched nations notice that the God of Abraham was unlike any other, not made of stone or wood, but living, faithful, merciful. And always he returned in memory to the mountain, the place where his heart had been laid bare, the place where mercy had met obedience, the place where God had revealed himself not only as the Almighty, not only as the promise giver, but as the provider, Jehovah Jireh. Abraham's nights grew quieter in his final years. He often lay beneath the stars, the same stars he had once been asked to count. He knew now that he would never number them. But he also knew that God already had. Every star a soul, every spark a descendant, every light a testimony that the promise was still alive. And when he looked at Isaac, strong and steady, he saw the first fruits of that promise. When he looked at the tents of his household, filled with laughter and life, he saw the mercy of God at work. When he closed his eyes in prayer, he saw again the ram in the thicket. And he rested. He knew that his story was not the end. He knew that the God who had called him would carry the promise long after his bones had been laid to rest. He knew that nations would be blessed, that kings would rise, that prophets would speak. And though he could not see the fullness, he trusted that one day another lamb would come. Not for one man, not for one family, but for all. And so his life became a lantern of faith passed from one generation to the next. Isaac carried it. Jacob would carry it after him. The people of Israel would carry it through wilderness and kingdom and exile. And in time the light would lead to the one who was both the promised seed and the provided lamb. Abraham breathed his last in fullness of years, satisfied not by wealth alone, not by descendants alone, but by the faithfulness of God that had held him from first call to final breath. And when he was gathered to his fathers, his story did not end. It lived on in the covenant. It lived on in Isaac. It lived on in every prayer whispered with the name of the mountain. Jehovah Jireh. Isaac stood at his father's grave with Rebekah at his side. The memory of Moriah burned in his heart still. But now it burned as legacy. For the God who had provided for Abraham would provide for him too. And the covenant would not die with one man. It would live until all nations were blessed. The story of Abraham closed like a book placed gently upon a shelf. But the story of God's promise continued, carried forward by hands younger than his. Guided by the same God who had never failed. Take a long breath here. And let the peace of Abraham's ending become your peace tonight. The God who was faithful in his beginning, in his waiting, in his testing, was faithful in his end. And that same God watches over your life as surely as he watched over his. Let your soul rest in the truth that his provision is not bound to one mountain, nor to one generation. It flows like a river across time. Reaching Abraham. Reaching Isaac. Reaching you. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. The story of Abraham and Isaac lingers like the final glow of embers after a fire has burned low. Its warmth does not fade quickly. It remains, steady and quiet, a reminder that God's faithfulness endures long after the hardest tests have passed. The mountain still stands in memory. Moriah. The place where obedience was tested. Where mercy was revealed. Where the name Jehovah Jireh was spoken aloud. The Lord will provide. That name became more than the name of a place. It became the song of generations. The assurance whispered in times of fear. The testimony repeated in moments of doubt. For the God who provided upon that mountain is the same God who has provided in every age since. He did not ask Abraham for surrender in order to take life away, but in order to show that he alone holds life secure. He did not bind Isaac to wood in order to destroy, but in order to reveal that no human sacrifice could satisfy. Only the mercy of God himself could provide the way. Centuries later, another hill would rise. Another wood would be carried upon the shoulders of a son. And this time, there would be no ram in the thicket. No voice to stay the hand. For upon Calvary, the Father gave his only Son. And the Son gave himself willingly. The shadow of Moriah became the substance of the cross. The foreshadowed Lamb became the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. What Abraham glimpsed dimly, we now see clearly. The Lord provides not only daily bread, not only rescue from trial, but salvation itself. In Christ, the promise spoken to Abraham finds its fullness. All nations are blessed. All families are offered mercy. All who believe are counted as children of the covenant. And yet, even before Calvary, even before Bethlehem, the lesson of Moriah stands true for us tonight. Trust does not end in despair. Surrender does not leave us empty. faith does not go unrewarded. The God who tests is the God who provides. The God who asks is the God who gives. The God who commands is the God who keeps his word. Abraham's obedience teaches us that faith is more than believing in promises. It is entrusting even the dearest treasures back into God's hands. Isaac's surrender teaches us that trust is more than asking questions. It is resting in the love of the one who leads us. Together their story becomes a gentle invitation to rest our own burdens, our own fears, our own uncertainties, in the care of the God who provides. Tonight, as you lay down to rest, let the memory of Moriah quiet your heart. Imagine the mountain bathed in late afternoon light, the altar built, the ram provided, the smoke rising peacefully into the sky. Father and son walking back down together, side by side. Alive, whole, secure in mercy. Let that picture carry you towards sleep. The same God who met them there meets you here. The same God who provided for them provides for you. The same God who spoke then speaks still. Do not be afraid. I will provide. I will bless. I will keep you. Oi. Breathe slowly. Let go of the weight of your own altar. Release the things you hold tightly, afraid to lose. Place them gently into his hands. For he is faithful. He is merciful. He is good. And as you rest, remember, Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. He provided for Abraham. He provided for Isaac. He has provided in Christ. And he will provide for you. Rest now in that assurance. Let the story of Abraham and Isaac cradle you into peace. Let the name of Jehovah Jireh be your pillow. Let the faithfulness of God be your blanket. Let his presence be your rest. And as your eyes grow heavy, know this: the God who never sleeps will keep watch. The one who spared Isaac, the one who sent his son, the one who holds your life, will be faithful through the night and into the morning. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Yesterday, today, and forever.